Hello guys, welcome back to yet another video in InfoTrack TV. My name is Gerald Hoong and I'm one of the active trainers in InfoTrack training products for Microsoft Azure. And unlike other product videos that you have already seen, probably I've done quite a number of that for SQL Server, for SharePoint, for Visual Studio, right? As you know, Azure is not seriously a product of its own, okay? And this is an entirely a cloud-based ecosystem, and there are many components and services that revolve around Azure. There are practically hundreds of them. And I cannot be just talking about each and every one of the components in the video. That would take me hours to do that. So what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to give a very rough overview about what is Azure, the fundamentals of it, what are the individual components that you will need to have knowledge about, right? And of course, if you want to know about taking courses to guide the learning path of Azure, you can browse through some of my videos which I seriously talk about the courses and explain the outline, right, and the roadmap of being, let's say, an Azure certified administrator, a developer, all right, a solution architect, or even a DevOps engineer. So I'm not going to go into that because those videos were there. It's already there. You can just browse that. Instead, what I'm going to cover in this video is just a very simple. I'm not going to bore you, because I just don't have that kind of time to cover every bits and pieces of what's available in Azure. So let's just dive right in and what you can expect in Azure. Now, for those of you who are really new about what is this Azure, so Microsoft Azure, spelled as A-Z-U-R-E, it's not called Azure, it's called Azure. This is Microsoft's equivalent to AWS, all right? Amazon Web Service, you've got Google Cloud, right? So Microsoft's Azure is Microsoft's own cloud platform and is one of the fastest growing cloud platform. I can say that it's by now as big and as complete, as intensive as AWS. So those of you who are no longer new in Azure, you're already on Azure, you should know all this by now. Okay, in terms of courses, right, what is stipulated by Microsoft, there are actually 4 major roles that you can play on Azure. Being number 1 is going to be being an administrator on Azure. Number 2, you can become a developer for Azure. Number 3, being a solution architect. And number 4, which is another side spin-off from Azure, which is called the DevOps Engineer. Now, I'm going to base on these kind of roles that you can be or you can undertake on Azure to explain to you the coverage of certain components, not everything in depth, but only those essential bare metal components that you need to have on Azure. So I'm going to begin with administrator right now. You'll be exposed and you need knowledge about your entire Azure subscription. How you manage, how you create, and how you administer your subscription. What you can do in each of the Azure subscription. What are the things essentially you get inside an Azure. So number 1, of course, you're going to learn how to build an Azure VM. So a virtual machine, right, is pretty much like what you know about, let's say, a VMware virtual machine or maybe Windows Hyper-V virtual machines. Now, it's just that this virtual machine or a VM, it's now created, provisioned, and running directly on the cloud. It's on Azure. So you don't need to provision and you don't need to reserve some sort of your own physical box or server and then install or run a VM there. So everything is on the cloud and everything is done through a browser. Now, browser, it can be Microsoft Edge, it can be Chrome, it can be Firefox, anything, all right? So virtual machines, when you create them, a number of virtual machines based on different types of operating systems are available on Azure. Now, the good part about Azure is that, unlike the old days when Azure was first started, they only support Windows only. But today, your VMs, you can practically create a VM running Linux, you can running Windows, and Linux, speaking of that, there can be different flavors of Linux. Even CentOS, Ubuntu, you can run Red Hat or SUSE, So these are all the different OS that you can build your VMs on. And of course, the next component that when you have a VM on the cloud, a VM or VMs should be part of a network. All right, so there you go. You have another one called a virtual network, which essentially is called a VNet. So you will learn parts and parcel about what forms a VNet. You give a VNet a name, and each of the VM you're going to tie it to a network interface card, an NIC or more NICs, right? And each one of them will be assigned with a public IP, right? And which is connected essentially maybe to a load balancer, and it's going to be part of the virtual network. All right. So these are some of the things essentially that forms the integral component of Azure. Now, of course, apart from that, VM and virtual networks and all that, you will be also you will get also something called the Azure Storage. Now, Azure Storage, right, is an essential backbone for storing all your data, be it files or maybe just pure data. Now, a typical Azure Storage comes in 4 different subtypes. And Azure Storage can support blob type of storage, blob files. It can be a file share, it can be a table, or a queue. So speaking of queue, there is also another service called the Service Bus, which is essentially a much more robust type of queues for you to store messages, right, that forms part of your asynchronous processing environment. So simple queue is also part of an Azure Storage. So that is also being tested, okay, in becoming an Azure Administrator. And on top of that as well, there is one huge component that provides authentication, which is essentially like your on-premise Active Directory or AD. In Azure, you have something called the Azure AD or Azure Active Directory. That's where you create all the users, and each of these users will be granted permission, right, to access any one of the resources available on your Azure subscription. And each of these users, just like your on-premise Active Directory, they can be made a member of one or more groups. So it is just a mirror copy of what you have on your on-premise Active Directory with what they have to offer on Azure Active Directory. And of course, if you have a little bit more money, you can actually invest in Azure Active Directory Premium, right? P2 plan, which gives you something like you can extend it to support MFA. All right, MFA stands for multi-factor authentication, which allows you to not just providing every user a means to log in with their username or password. You can also send a code or a text to their trusted device. You know, that's like double factor or two-factor authentication or more than that. Okay, so there you go. These are some of the components essentially for an administrator. Now, moving on to being a developer. Now, what are options or components that you have to learn that covers a developer scope? You see, a developer actually develops solutions or services, right, in which you will now publish directly to the cloud. Now, let's give it, for example, you are building a website. Now, those days, you will need to deploy your website onto your own on-prem hosted IIS or a web server. So now you have an option of publishing directly onto the cloud, onto Azure, whereby you've got two options. Number one, you can build Azure, okay, a Windows Server VM running on Azure, which you also install a web server role. You configure a web server role which is running IIS, and that's where you also deploy your website onto. Okay, so the difference is that you do not have your own box, right? The whole IIS web server is on the cloud. Or number two, which is the simplified and much more faster to market thing, is a serverless architecture. You can use something called an app service. An Azure app service allows you to quickly assign a URL with a virtually serverless architecture. It's something like having an IIS, but you don't have an IIS, but you have a fully qualified URL already for you to deploy and publish your website onto, or even your web services onto it, and then immediately it functions just like that. So there you go, you have got a serverless architecture or with a server-based architecture. Even with a server-based architecture, everything is on Azure. Now the next thing that you can learn about, what you have on Azure, right? It's your data storage, your database. Now just like your web server, which you can have a server, a VM running IIS, or a serverless architecture, which is an app service. For data storage, right, you can also build a virtual machine running SQL Server, right, and that's where you store your data, your database. Or you can effectively create a simplified server, right, virtually without installing a VM and installing SQL Server in there, which is called Azure SQL Database. So just create a server by name, and you just create the database running on that server by name, right? So that's on the serverless architecture for the database storage. Now, essentially, right, on top of all these components, you will have other types of components. Now, since Azure today has matured to a lot of other coverage for non-Microsoft systems, now let's talk about even Linux. Now, today, you can actually create a Linux server, right, that acts as a hub for Docker services, your containerized application environment. You can use or make use of the Linux Docker hub, where you create all your containers inside the Docker hub, or you can even opt for the Azure Kubernetes service, right, which you create pods, which is also to support containerized applications. And speaking of all these containerized applications environment which you can now quickly build on Azure, you can also now opt for even NoSQL initiative, whereby you can opt for databases which you create, which are essentially non-table based, non-relational databases, such as the Azure what they call Cosmos DB, formerly known as Azure Document DB, which the Cosmos DB you can opt to connect to a different a series of APIs available. Now, the natural one, you can connect it, you can create a Cosmos DB that is using SQL API, or you can use a Mongo API or Cassandra, right? So there are many options out there for you. And when we talk about solution architect, of course, this is a mixture of both the administrator skill set together with the developer skill set. So what you're going to learn, okay, will be a deeper understanding of even the security part on the Azure Active Directory, virtual machines planning, the service plan set, right, as well as your services or solutions that you intend to publish and deploy onto Azure. So the last part, which is effectively quite popular today, would be the Azure DevOps. Now, Azure DevOps is practically a platform which is essentially having their own separate website, their own portal that mirrors the developers' team development effort, whereby those old days, right, okay, you can have an on-premise team foundation server where all your developers will be connected to check in your code and do a team build and all that. So since today we talk about continuous integration, continuous delivery, so all this can be achieved with a cloud-based service called Azure DevOps. Now, formerly known as Azure Visual Studio Team Services, today they call it as Azure DevOps. So there is actually a course, okay, which you can actually scroll through the list of videos that I've actually created, okay, to outline what are the coverage of all these courses. So do take note, okay, that this video, like I mentioned, I just want to keep it simple to give you a heads up about roughly what are the components that you find in Azure, to give you a head start, at least a surface level understanding what you will get when you subscribe to Azure, and then from there on you can start planning ahead for your training needs. So there you go. I do not want to keep it too long because I do not want to bore you guys to death. Okay, I have just so much time in a video to talk about essentially what's going to be in for a certain type of product. So I'm signing off, right? This is actually the video about Azure. Please feel free to contact any salesperson from InfoTrack to inquire about courses available for Azure. All right, until the next video, I'll see you guys soon and good luck. Thanks.